of it. The skeletons per se. All the inefficiencies.
That if your worldview is right, that it's matter and energy evolved to a higher order, show me a pound of love. Show me a foot of justice.
Those are all constructed in your brain.
Okay, good. So then love is simply a biochemical reaction, and that's all justice is, a biochemical reaction.
A very complex one, yes, but
that's all there is.
look at the long-term things and rationally try and have self-discipline to make the right decision over the long haul.
Good. But listen to you speak. Listen to the words that you use. You can do the right thing.
Right.
You can use your reason. Well, sir, if there is no God, there is no right thing in an objective sense. Obviously, in a subjective sense, there is. But you know better than that. You know that by using your reason, you can get in touch with objective truth. Wow. That's a key piece of evidence that there's got to be some type of God who gave you your rational mind, who created these values, and they're real, and they really do benefit you. Right. And that's good.
But I'm saying evolution, like behavioral evolution, can explain why humans are predisposed to certain behaviors. Like, for example, lions practice infanticide. And obviously to humans, that's egregious under all circumstances. But that's just because that's not beneficial to us. We want to protect and nurture our children. While lions, they don't care about their offspring, their competitors' offsprings, and they kill them because that's just their survival strategy. It works for them, doesn't work for us. So I'm saying different animals have different moral codes, and I'm saying that humans have a specific moral code that is reinforced by society and created by our evolutionary history that we can try and follow, and it'll make everybody more successful.
But is it more reasonable to believe that your rational mind comes from the irrational or the non-rational? Or is it more reasonable to believe that your rational mind comes from a rational mind?
Are you saying you're disputing evolution? Or?
No, I'm disputing the philosophical. I'm not disputing evolution as a scientific theory. I'm disputing a philosophy of evolution that says the rational can come from the non-rational. That's ludicrous. Everything in my experience shows me the rational comes from the rational never comes from the non-rational or the irrational. But an atheist is someone who says, I believe in a miracle. And the miracle that I believe in is the rational comes from the non-rational. That's a miracle. The only problem is my atheist friend has no miracle worker.
Consciousness is an emergent property. I mean, it's very well defined how a rational mind works. It's not a mystery. There's nothing mysterious about how the mind works in that absolute sense. We can say how the rationality is an emergent property of, irrational particles, if you would, of irrational cells. I mean, it's not a mystery.
This is not you're right. It's not a mystery to begin to work through how does the brain work. That's not the issue I'm raising. The issue I'm raising is, if you're an atheist, you believe that the rational mind ultimately comes from the irrational.
Right.
Now, is that more reasonable for you to believe that the rational mind comes from the irrational, or is it more reasonable, more plausible to believe the rational mind comes from a rational mind, Creator God?
But basically, that's the whole argument of that is, if it can all be explained via evolution, doesn't need. Basically, it's the same argument of intelligent design of, oh, well, something ordered needs an order creator. That's a fallacy. Is it more reasonable to believe order came from disorder or order came from order? Obviously, order came from order. That's just semantic argument. We know for a fact that order can come from disorder in a kind of semantic way, but it's very well defined. It's not a mystery. I mean, it sounds better. Obviously, it sounds appealing to say, order comes from order, but that's just not the case.
No, order doesn't come from order. Order comes from an intelligent mind. You don't get designer genes without a designer. You don't get a building without an architect. You don't get an automobile without a mechanic. You don't get a message written in the sand, John loves Mary, without a rational mind to put that kind of information together. So, an atheist is having to believe in a bunch of miracles. That life comes from non-life, that the rational comes from the irrational, that chaos moves to order by chance. Those are all miracles. The only problem is the atheist doesn't have a miracle worker, no God. You've got a major logical problem there, a major philosophical problem. It has nothing to do with evolution. This is a philosophical issue, not a scientific issue.
Wait, how could it not be a scientific issue?
Because science, sir, is a study of process, how the thing works. The question, is there an intelligent mind behind the thing, is not a scientific question. You can't scientifically prove God, you can't scientifically disprove God. Rather, you've got a philosophical question, which is it more reasonable to believe that behind the process, whatever the process is, evolution, micro, macro, whatever, is it more reasonable to believe that behind the process there's an intelligent mind, or is it more reasonable to believe that behind the process there's no intelligent mind?
But you see, we can show through science that everything in the universe, the way it is right now, can have happened without God, as in God is an unnecessary component, as in everything, the way things are right now, can be perfectly explained without God.
Nope. Richard Dawkins can do some good science. He's a lousy philosopher. Richard Dawkins can't punch his way out of a wet paper bag philosophically. Scientifically, he's brilliant. But you've got to think through this issue, guys. You cannot scientifically show that God exists. You cannot scientifically show God does not exist, because science is based on the repeatability of an experiment. If you can't repeat it, sir, it's not science. So the question, is there an intelligent mind behind the universe, is not a scientific question. It is a philosophical, theological question. You can't mix the two.
Basically, I think science is a study of the universe, and if you're saying God created and orders the universe, that's a pretty bold statement about the nature of our universe. And to say that science can't touch that, if you really do believe God is part of the universe and one with the universe and the creator of everything in this universe, how can you say that he's not subject to scientific interpretation? Because I mean, that's a pretty bold statement about origins, isn't it?
Scientifically show me that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth.
The burden of proof is on the proposer. You show me that God exists. You're proposing a hypothesis about how the universe came to be, so where's your evidence? I don't have to give you evidence to prove that you're wrong. You have to give me evidence to prove you're right. That's how any rational being...
You have put forth the statement that science can do it all. Okay? What you basically said is, Cliff, unless you can scientifically prove something, it's not true. Okay, that's what you've said. Now, just think. Would you please scientifically prove to me that unless I can scientifically prove something, it's not true?
Not about things like, values and morals, but I'm talking about things like the origin of the universe.
How about going on a date? Do you go on a scientific date? How about the way your family lives? Does your family live on scientific laws when you go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas vacation? How about history, Abraham Lincoln, which I was raising? Is there any historical fact that you prove scientifically? You guys get Abraham Lincoln back here every fall to have him assassinated by John Wilkes Booth to prove scientifically that indeed John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln? Okay. No. See, scientific knowledge is based on the repeatability of an experiment. Bravo! Very good. But don't make the mistake of thinking that's all there is to knowledge and truth. Scientific knowledge based on the repeatability of an experiment. Sir, historical knowledge is a wonderfully legitimate form of knowledge. It has nothing to do with repeatability. It has to do with the trustworthiness of eyewitness testimony. Somebody saw Lincoln shot. They recorded what they saw. And guess what? This university has the audacity to charge you guys big bucks to take these history courses that have nothing to do with science. They have everything to do with history, which is based on the trustworthiness of an eyewitness seeing it happen. You don't repeat it.
I'm not saying science can answer everything, but I'm saying that the role of science is to describe physical phenomena.
Yes.
Right. And to say the role you have for God is as a part of this physical universe. It'd be one thing if you're saying, okay, here's the philosophies of Jesus, I think they should be applied to our society. Then science has no dictation of that. Your philosophical point of view is your own opinion, and that's a different field. But when you start talking about Jesus rose from the dead, well, there has to be a physiological explanation as to how that happened. If you want to say Jesus is the Son of God and God created the world and God created you, there has to be, since we are all made out of physical particles, there has to be a physical explanation for that physical phenomena. And that's where science can ask, how did that happen?
Well, sure, you could ask the question, how physically did Jesus rise from the dead? But I can promise you the Bible never gets close to that issue. There is absolutely no scriptural attempt to answer the question, What was the physical process that God used to raise Jesus back to life? So I don't know from the Bible how Jesus rose from the dead physically, medically, scientifically. But you see, sir, because the Bible does not attempt to answer that question does not mean that the Bible contradicts science. The Bible is silent, and you cannot build an argument out of silence. So science does not contradict the Bible because there's no science in the Bible to contradict. By science, I mean a description of process, how the thing happens. So just because we don't have a scientific explanation of how Jesus rose from the dead doesn't mean that historically the dead Christ didn't rise from the dead, because the eyewitnesses saw Christ die. They knew where he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a very well-known tomb. 3 days later, the tomb was empty. The enemies of Christ could have easily gone to the tomb and produced the dead body of Christ, but the problem was the tomb was empty. Then these women claimed to have seen Christ risen from the dead, and over a period of 40 days, Christ appears to over 500 people at different times in different places, risen from the dead. And these eyewitnesses who see the risen Christ are willing to die for what they had seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. That's why faith in Christ is not blind faith. It's based on historical, not scientific, historical evidence.
But I'm saying scientifically the idea of God itself is implausible.
How? How does science disprove God?
Well, where's your proof for God?
You don't
The burden of
scientifically
proof
prove
is on
God.
the-
You don't scientifically disprove God.
The burden of
God
proof
is not a
is on the
scientific
observer.
question.
It's on the proof of burden is on the proposer.
Fine. Philosophically, I will tell you why I believe God exists. First point. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. The universe is not eternal. The Big Bang, Arnold Penzias' discovery in 1963, clearly points us to the fact the universe is not eternal, it has a beginning. Well, guess what, guys? Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. God is that uncaused cause.
But see, that's saying, yes, the universe had a beginning at the Big Bang, but the matter that composes the universe doesn't necessarily could be eternal. That's basically, at that point, it was a singularity, which is outside the laws of science, periods, outside the laws of everything. So nothing can be said about the matter before the Big Bang. It could have existed for all eternity, who knows, but that's not, it's basically irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant. Because at this point, the evidence is there was not matter and energy before the Big Bang. Now, that could change, and if it changes, fine, then I will not have that piece of evidence. But at this point, the evidence is that 15 billion years ago, when the Big Bang occurred, before the Big Bang, there was not matter, there was not energy. And the Big Bang started it all.
It was in a singularity.
Yeah, but the evidence at this point is, before the Big Bang, there's no matter, no energy. Now, that could change, but astronomers at this point lean towards that. That's why Albert Einstein moved from pantheism to believing that God exists, because the Big Bang, which says the universe is not eternal. The whole Aristotelian idea that matter and energy in the universe are eternal was blown to bits by the Big Bang. Maybe that'll change tomorrow.
As I said, the universe, as we know it, the definable universe is not eternal, but where it came from, the singularity is undefinable. And so to arbitrarily say God created it is basically, you could say anything you want.
No, that's not what I said.
No one could know anything.
Come on now, you know that's not what I said. What I said was, because of the Big Bang,
Right.
we know that there's a beginning to the universe.
Right.
Everything that has a beginning has a cause. Point 2, the universe has a beginning. Point 3, therefore the universe has a cause. So God is that uncaused cause that began the universe. That's a piece of evidence, not proof, but evidence. Second piece of evidence that God exists is order and design points to an intelligent mind, 100 times out of 100 in my experience. Now, maybe your experience is different. But if I prepare a delicious meal, set it before you, and then say to you, there's no cook, that's absurd. If I tell you that the building over there is a result of a hurricane sweeping through a brickyard, that's absurd. Order and design, in 100 times out of 100 in my experience of life, points us to an intelligent mind, an architect, a builder, a tailor, designer jeans, a chef, a delicious meal. So, Voltaire, who was no follower of Christ, put it this way. Voltaire said, if the existence of a watch proves a watchmaker, then the existence of the universe proves a great architect. If not, I consent to be called a fool. When you have order and design, it demands an intelligent mind of some type.
No, it's basically all those things you described, or inorganic, created things.
Created?
The things you described, watches, buildings, all those things do not have the ability to self-reproduce. Life is the exception. We can see how from non-life, life comes. We can see the process of evolution.
Show me how life comes from non-life.
When you eat something that's dead, when
You eat dead stuff?
when you take in iron in your diet, all those minerals, those are incorporated into your body and become part of your living self.
Okay.
All the minerals in your body, that's non-life being used to create life. I mean, we can see exactly the processes by how
That's a digestive tract, taking food and digesting it and taking nutrients out of food. I'm a living being. This inanimate matter does not produce animate life.
right.
You never get life from non-life. Never. Plants come from plants, not from inanimate
Right.
matter. Animals come from animals, not from inanimate matter. Human life comes from human life, not from
We can
inanimate matter.
define how that happens without using a god to evoke how it happens. It's a very well-defined process of how that occurs. We don't need to invoke God to explain how it came about. And there's lots of, as for example, I would say the best proof as to why there is no intelligent designer is there's littered throughout your genome, the DNA that makes up your body, there's these things called pseudogenes. And these things are basically junk DNA. They have no purpose, but they have the resemblances of old genes, but they just randomly stop working. They're useless, they're pointless. They have no value at all except they're just remnants of evolution. Now, why it makes the only explanation is that genes and DNA, they evolved spontaneously and they weren't intelligently created. That's just one of many evidence in that.
Okay, just because there's chaos in the world does not mean that there's not some order. I agree with you. There's chaos. There's disorder. There's disharmony. Second law of thermodynamics. We don't just keep evolving to a higher level. Things fall apart. All right, so I agree with you that there's chaos, but there still is order. If you get sick enough, you're going to go to the most talented doctor you know of to straighten out the disorder in your body, the chaos in your body, be it a cancer cell, be it clogged arteries, whatever. You're not going to go to some street person and say, hey, why don't you try and give me a new heart? You're going to go to someone who understands the order and the design of the human body.
Right.
So, sir, you cannot escape that even though there is chaos and disorder and disharmony, we agree, there's also amazing order and design. That demands some type of intelligent mind.
I'm saying basically science has shown the process by which life can evolve, and also the remnants of this process are directly observable in the life itself, as in we can see in the life itself how there's evidence of it. The skeletons per se, all
Okay.
the
Okay,
inefficiencies.
then if your worldview is right, that it's matter and energy evolved to a higher order, show me a pound of love. Show me a foot of justice.
Those are all constructed in your brain.
Okay,
Neural
good.
pathways.
So then love is simply a biochemical reaction, and that's all justice is, a biochemical reaction.
A very complex one, yes, but
But that's all there is.
what else would it be?
What else would it be? Well,
It's an idea.
if there's a God, then it means that there's more to you and me than just biochemical reactions. There's a soul, a personality, which means there's a free will, which means I could choose right now to be highly disrespectful to you, or I can choose to respect you. And to tell you the truth, I'm very grateful to you for the way you've been so respectful to me.
And like
I don't think you had to be. I think you could have chosen to be highly disrespectful to me. In matter of fact, if you right now haul back and start calling me expletives, I'm going to hold you responsible. I'm going to say, hey man, you should not do that. And if you look me in the face and say, I'm sorry, Cliff, it's just my biochemical reactions going off, I'm not going to accept that. Similarly, when she looks you in the face and says, I love you, I don't think you think, okay, great. I excite her sex glands, so that's what she means. But according to your worldview, that's exactly what she means.
There's nothing, a man-eating lion, it can't really be held responsible for what it does, but it still needs to be found and shot to prevent harm. So a criminal, though they might have no free will on what they did, they still need to be locked away. They still need to be removed from society. It just, that's just the way the world works, and they need to be punished for even your own vindication, because it makes you feel good to see them punished, even though they had no choice in the matter. It still makes you feel good to see them punished, and it removes them from society. So that's why you do it.
Okay, good. Talk to me about it makes me feel good to see someone punished for the evil that they did. It sounds to me like you appreciate justice.
Right. Most people do, yes.
Okay, good. But if all of reality is simple matter and energy evolved to a higher order, what is justice?
It's what you perceive it to be. What you and your peers agree on as defining as justice. I mean, there's a reason why it used to be if you were caught sleeping with, the neighbor's wife, you'd be killed or whatever, and now you might just get divorced. There's different changes in what's considered justice. It used to be a literal eye for an eye, and now it's just more metaphorical. I mean, what you define as retribution and justice is very dependent on what everyone agrees on.
Is justice real, or is it simply an arbitrary value that everybody agrees on? What do you think?
Arbitrary value that everyone agrees on.
Arbitrary value, okay. Dr. Martin Luther King is in jail in Birmingham, Alabama. The white ministers in Birmingham have said, Dr. Martin Luther King, you need to understand that the laws of the great state of Alabama legislate segregation. You, Dr. Martin Luther King, by invading the great state of Alabama and coming to Birmingham to try and change those laws, you're out of line. So get back into line. Dr. Martin Luther King writes a letter from the Birmingham jail to the ministers of Birmingham saying, gentlemen, there is a law above the law of the great state of Alabama. And if the great state of Alabama cannot legislate laws that are in agreement with the laws of God, then the laws of the state of Alabama are wrong. They are unjust. Do you think Dr. Martin Luther King was tripping on drugs, or do you think he was in touch with reality?
Basically, in my opinion, I believe that yes, those laws were unjust, but the people at the time came from a point of view at which they thought that was what was just for them, and it's a good thing that it changed. It's a good thing that people now have, I guess, a better sense of what really is just. But at the time, that's what that society constructed as moral, and it's a good thing that everybody was able to reconsider, was able to reevaluate and overthrow these illogical, harmful policies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, I guess it doesn't negate the fact that the people still came about and tried to make what was best in their mind for their society.
Who defines better sense of justice?
As I said, you and your current peers. And so currently right now, everyone here, I would assume, is in agreement with the fact that segregation is wrong, because we have our own logical, persuasions as to why that's the case, and we're going to fight to keep that the case. But those people at the time, I'm sure they had their own justifications as to why segregation was necessary. And obviously by our standards now, we can see the irrational aspect of that, but they were doing what they thought was best, and obviously by our standpoint, it was wrong, and it's a good thing they got rid of it. But I don't understand why that detracts from the arbitrary nature of justice.
Well, then I haven't been able to communicate very well, because obviously Dr. Martin Luther King's whole argument was, you are right, white ministers of Birmingham. I am violating the laws of my culture, the state of Alabama. The only way you can critique your culture is if you believe that there is a law above the law of your culture. If you don't believe that there's a law above the law of your culture, how do you critique your culture?
Because you just come to different conclusions. Martin Luther King looked at the situation and said, having African Americans subjugated is bad on all these different levels, and here's why it needs to be changed. And he went about and found other people who agreed with him, rallied, organized it, and helped get those laws changed based off of, and everyone saw the moral and rational logic for it and had those laws changed to match with their new definition of what is moral and what's just. And I mean, you use from what your own logic to critique your society. It doesn't necessarily, you can get inspiration from the Bible or the Quran or any sort of philosophy that you want to help shape your mind. I mean...
Right. But if you are an atheist, if you think there is no God, then you have no rational, intellectual basis for believing that there's an objective moral. Nietzsche poured scorn on fellow atheists who said there is no God, but do unto others as you would have them do unto you is a good thing. He says, no, it's not a good thing in any objective sense. Maybe you want to call it good, but that's your own ephemeral prejudice, bias. It's all relative.
Right. Basically, I agree that it's all relative, but you see, what people say is, I'm not a nihilist because though it's relative, it's not meaningless.
Oh, really? Why not?
Because it has meaning to me. And that's
How?
How?
Yeah.
Because that's how I'm hardwired to feel certain ways in response to different things.
Good. But with your head, you understand that if you murder me or if you feed me dinner, it's meaningless. So just choose whatever option you choose. Either murder me or give me dinner. It's meaningless.
No, it's meaningful to me because, okay, for example, if I were to murder you from a pragmatic point of view, I would obviously face the repercussions of society. But from a moral stand of view, I wouldn't want to murder you, period. And also, it would cause grief to your family, to my family, and it would just be bad for everyone in general. So that's why I don't do it. Not because, oh, the Bible says not to, because it's against a commandment, I don't want to go to hell. It has nothing to do with hell. Basically, I do basically what I want to do because it makes me feel right, not because I fear judgment, not because I fear some sort of, you know, eternal damnation.
Oh, now, wait a second. You know very, very well that you appreciate judgment. You know very, very well that you appreciate evil being apprehended. That's right. Judgment.
Right.
So all that Jesus is saying when he talks about hell is that God is good, God is just, and evil ultimately loses. Evil does not ultimately win. That's why there's a hell. That's what hell is. Hell is a statement. Evil ultimately loses. Evil will be judged. It will ultimately be apprehended. It will lose. It is not eternal. It'll be destroyed. Now remember, your worldview says no. Evil will win.
No?
Of course it does.
Sometimes, I guess it depends what you define as evil, but I guess the way I would define evil usually actually tends to lose because people I don't think are inherently evil, because being evil is very socially destructive. I don't think people are naturally evil, and thus if you look at these very totalitarian states and regimes, they usually end up losing to a freer, more harmonious society where people are more happy. So I don't think evil necessarily wins. I don't think good necessarily wins, but I do think it's usually somewhere in the middle of what, you know, the status quo is.
Right, but if there is no God, if there is no day of judgment, sir, the good die young at times. And evil, corrupt people get away with murder, get away with stealing. And selfish people, selfish men, rip off their wives, divorce them, and some parents are incredibly irresponsible, abuse their children emotionally, physically. They never get apprehended.
Right.
So if there is no God, there is no day of judgment, and evil wins, sir. And I can promise you, the typical African American is not ultimately going to get justice and fairness in this life, especially if they were born here 100 years ago. So evil wins too frequently in this world, in the here and now. Right. And if there is no God, if there is no day of judgment, then ultimately evil wins.
You got to try your best to oppose it, but that's just the brutal nature of existence.
Good. That's why despair is the only logical conclusion for you as an atheist.
Why despair?
Because evil wins too often. Evil wins. Suck it up, realize it, that's reality. And you have no hope that goodness and justice will ultimately triumph. If you're a secularist, if you're an atheist, you're saying this is all there is to reality, and if you're born on the wrong side of the tracks, and if you're born HIV positive, tough luck. It's the way the ball bounces.
Right. You hope things get better. You hope that basically things do swing, as, for example, as you pointed out, in certain times very evil situations arise, as in Nazi Germany or Japan,
Right.
World War II. Those kind of situations do arise, and they can swing back more towards the middle ground, as in philosophies do change. Slavery is abolished, and so you can have hope that things are going to move in what you view as the ideal situation. And I just think by human nature, though, yes, I don't think there will ever be heaven on earth. There's never going to be a perfection, a utopia, but I think we are progressing more and more towards something as close as we can get to that.
Okay. Let me tell you why I'm glad there's a hell. There will be a hell. Miroslav Volf, who teaches at Yale Divinity School, wrote a book called Exclusion and Embrace. Miroslav Volf is a Croatian. Miroslav Volf has watched Bosnian Serbs rape Muslim women. Miroslav Volf has watched Muslims rape and murder other Croatians. Miroslav Volf began to think about it. He began to ask himself, who are the people who can forgive? Who are the people who are trapped in this cycle of retaliation, revenge, retaliation, revenge? Miroslav Volf began to realize it's the people who understand that there's a day of judgment coming and there's a holy, good God who will punish evil, who are in a position to forgive. Those who believe simply that God is non-existent or that God is simply love cannot forgive. Why? When you see your sister raped and murdered, you have such a cry for justice welling up within you that the idea, oh, you know why you shouldn't do evil? Because evil ultimately doesn't win, is hollow, empty, and meaningless. The power to forgive, Miroslav Volf began to realize, ultimately comes when you begin to realize God is just. Because God is just, there will be a day of judgment. You as a human being are to forgive. But that human being will be judged by God one day for the atrocities that they have committed. And Miroslav Volf does a great job saying, now wait a second. If you live in the United States and you got a nice police force and a nice National Guard and a strong military, and if you live in the comfort of suburbia, of course you can sit back and say, well, God is all loving, so everybody goes to heaven if there is a heaven. And you shouldn't do evil because evil doesn't work. It's not pragmatically wise. But if you live in a situation where your children are being raped and murdered, justice so cries out that the only way to forgive that person and not sink into a cycle of retaliation and revenge is to understand that God will judge evil and evil will ultimately lose. It's a powerful argument he makes in that book, Exclusion and Embrace.
But I would argue that I think I agree, I see why, and I almost agree with that, as in if somebody raped and murdered my sister and got away with it, there's plenty of movies about this, law-abiding citizen, whatever. I would go out and kill that person. And I would, if they caught me, I would accept my punishment. I would say it was worth it. To kill that human being was worth my life being ruined.
Why?
Because I couldn't live with the fact that that person went unpunished by my definition of what I would want to see punishment.
Why?
Because I couldn't live with myself otherwise. That's how
Why?
I feel. That's how I feel. And other people, they would say, well, it hurts me so bad, but you know what? I love my life too much to give it up for this pursuit of justice. It doesn't mean that much to me, and that's their own opinion, and that's how they act. But the way I act is I would need to see that justice brought to fruition.
Good. In other words, sir, you cannot live out moral relativism. It is impossible. If your sister is raped and murdered, you cannot kick back and say, oh, it's relative. No. The way you're hardwired informs you that justice has been totally violated when that perpetrator attacked your sister. And therefore, you cry out for justice, not in a relative sense, but in an objective, absolute sense.
But I'm saying, though it's relative, it's still meaningful to me. That's the whole point, is that though morals are all relative, it doesn't mean that they don't have meaning to you. Your morals may be arbitrary, but they still have a personal connection to you. So it doesn't matter that there's no absolute precedent for it. It just, you do what makes you feel right. And that's enough to make you act that way.
All right. Now, that's why you should understand, I think, the cross of Christ. Because the cross of Christ brings together justice and forgiveness in a marvelous way. The cross of Christ is not a pretty sight. There's agony, there's injustice, but Christ insisted that he was laying down his life to pay the penalty for your wrongdoing and for my wrongdoing. I'm a dirty, rotten sinner. I deserve God's wrath for my selfishness, my pride, my greed, my racism, all of my evil. But Christ bled and died on a cross, taking the hit that I deserve for my evil, thereby offering me forgiveness. And so the whole issue of love of God and justice of God come together magnificently at the cross of Christ. And you understand both. I don't think you're willing to live out your moral relativism. I think you know that justice is a real value. And that's why you say, Cliff, I would go out and kill the guy who raped and murdered my sister. And I asked you why? And you say, well, because I just feel that way.
Right.
And well, just get in touch with that. That's very real, that conscience that informs you that the rape and murder of my sister is absolutely evil. Not relatively evil, it's absolutely evil. So evil that I'm going to go after the guy who murdered her and raped her and kill the guy.
Right. I mean, obviously, it wasn't immoral to the guy who did it, and so obviously he thought it was okay.
Right.
He, ran it through his head, and that seemed like a good idea to him.
Right.
And you know what? It doesn't matter to me that that's his value, and that's what he assigns to life. It has no value to me. What that means to me is that I'm going to live by my code, and he'll live by his code. And basically, luckily, I live in a society where most people share my code, and hopefully, I could get him sentenced to life imprisonment or the best punishment that our society deems.
And so you're right there where I would never want to go, which is morality comes out of the barrel of a gun. Because the police supports you and doesn't support him in your relative morality, you win because you got the power.
Right.
I think if you think about that, that's scary.
I mean, that's the only way it can be, right? I mean,
No!
obviously.
As a follower of Christ, I know very well that if you have 25 guns behind you,
Right.
and you go on date rape, you're doing that which is absolutely, objectively evil. I don't care how much power you got. I don't care how many guns you have behind you, because I'm convinced there is a real value of justice that your date rape is a total violation of.
Right.
But you see, you can't be in that position. All you can say is, well, subjectively, from my perspective, date rape is wrong. And then you say, okay, now what I've got is I've got my 25 guns behind me, so if I want to date rape, it's all relative, and that's okay. I mean, that is despair if you think about it. Life is meaningless. It doesn't matter whether you date rape her or whether you respect her.